ancient kingdom of Macedonia, where mountains touched the sky and valleys stretched like green velvet beneath the morning sun, there was a time when the world seemed infinite with possibility. The year was 356 BC, and in the royal palace of Pella, stone walls held secrets and whispers of destiny. You can almost see the marble columns catching the first rays of dawn, casting long shadows across polished floors. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine from distant forests and wildflowers from the palace gardens. In this place of quiet grandeur, where eagles soared above cypress trees and the gentle sound of fountains created a rhythm of peace, King Philip II awaited news, not with anxiety, but with the calm certainty of a man who had conquered much and understood the slow turning of time. The palace itself breathed with ancient energy, every stone placed with care by craftsmen long forgotten, every tapestry woven with threads of purple and gold. Outside the royal chambers, courtiers moved like shadows, their footsteps soft on worn pathways, and in the distance, beyond the palace walls, the kingdom of Macedonia stretched vast and beautiful, its people living their simple lives beneath the same sky that had witnessed countless sunrises. This was a world where gods walked among mortals in stories, where heroes were born and legends began in the most ordinary of moments. And on this particular day, as the sun climbed slowly over the mountains, painting the world in shades of amber and rose, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Yet it arrived not with thunder or trumpets, but with the gentle, inevitable rhythm of life itself, bringing with it a peace that would echo through the ages. Queen Olympias rested in her chambers, surrounded by the soft glow of oil lamps that flickered like captured starlight. The room was filled with the gentle fragrance of myrrh and frankincense, sacred scents that seemed to bless the very air. You can imagine the cool linens against her skin, the way the light danced on the walls, creating patterns that moved like living dreams. She was a woman of mystery and depth, her eyes holding the wisdom of the ancient mystery cults she followed with devotion. Around her, attendants moved with practiced grace, their movements as fluid as water, their whispers soft as falling leaves. The sounds of the palace were muffled here. Only the gentle rustle of fabric, the quiet breath of those who waited, the distant call of doves in the gardens. Time seemed to slow in this sacred space, each moment stretching like honey poured from a jar. Olympias had dreamed of serpents wreathed in divine fire, of Zeus himself blessing this child who was coming into the world. And whether these were true visions or the beautiful imaginings of a devoted heart mattered not, for belief itself has power, and she believed with every fiber of her being. The walls of her chamber were painted with scenes of gods and heroes, Dionysus with his ivy crown, Achilles in his glory, the muses dancing in eternal celebration, and these images seemed to glow with their own inner light as dawn broke across the world. Everything was in perfect balance: the cool and the warm, the dark and the light, the silence and the gentle sounds of life continuing its eternal dance. This moment held no fear, no pain, only the quiet certainty that something beautiful was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. And in this certainty, there was profound peace. On that same morning, as light touched the peaks of Mount Olympus, far to the south, word arrived like the gentlest of breezes. A son had been born to the royal house, and they named him Alexander, which means defender of men, a name that would echo through centuries like a bell rung in an ancient temple. The palace stirred with quiet celebration, not loud joy, but the deep satisfaction of something perfectly right. King Philip walked through the halls with measured steps, his hand trailing along stone walls that had witnessed generations of his ancestors. He thought of his own father and his father's father, and the long line of kings who had shaped Macedonia into what it was today. Outside, the kingdom went about its peaceful rhythms. Farmers tending olive groves where silver green leaves shimmered in the breeze. Shepherds guiding flocks through mountain meadows dotted with wildflowers. Fishermen casting nets into lakes that reflected the sky like polished bronze. None of them knew yet that a child had been born who would grow to change their world, but the world itself seemed to know, for the day was touched with an unusual clarity, a crystalline quality to the air that made everything appear more vivid, more alive. Eagles circled high above, their cries pure and clear, and in the palace gardens, roses bloomed with impossible perfection, their petals soft as silk, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness. This was how legends began, not with fire and fury, but with the simple miracle of birth, with the first breath of a child who would one day breathe the air of empires. Yet now, in this moment, there was only stillness and wonder, only the gentle rocking of a cradle and the soft songs of nurses, only the peace of a kingdom content in its mountains and valleys, and the infinite promise of a future not yet written. The seasons turned gently in Macedonia, and young Alexander grew like a sapling reaching toward the sun. By his 4th year, he had begun to notice the world beyond the palace walls, the way farmers worked the olive groves with patient rhythm, how shepherds guided their flocks across hillsides that turned gold in summer, the eternal dance of seasons that his ancestors had witnessed for generations. His first lessons came not from scrolls, but from observation, watching his father receive ambassadors from distant lands, men in strange robes speaking languages that sounded like music, bringing gifts of amber and ivory, incense and purple dye. Each visitor carried stories of their homelands, tales of mountains higher than any in Macedonia, rivers wider than imagination, cities where thousands lived in harmony beneath protective walls. listened with ears that heard everything, absorbing not just words, but the spaces between them, the meanings hidden in gestures and expressions. Already his mind worked differently than other children, seeing patterns where others saw chaos, understanding that every person carried an entire world within them. In the evenings, his mother would take him to her private chambers, where oil lamps cast dancing shadows on painted walls. There, she taught him of the mysteries of Dionysus, who brought both ecstasy and peace, of the old gods who walked the earth in elder days. She spoke of dreams and visions, of signs sent by powers beyond mortal understanding, and young Alexander would lie very still, watching the lamp flames flicker, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight. Yet there was no fear in this, only a deep and abiding calm, the certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, learning exactly what he needed to know, growing into whoever he was meant to become. And outside, the Macedonian night wrapped the palace in velvet darkness, studded with stars that had guided heroes home from Troy, that still shone with the same patient light, waiting, always waiting. When Alexander reached his 7th year, a change came to the rhythm of his days. His father, King Philip, decided it was time for formal education, and so the search began for a tutor worthy of a prince who might one day rule. Messengers rode to Athens, to Thebes, to all the great centers of learning in the Greek world, seeking the wisest of the wise. And while they searched, Alexander discovered the palace library, a room that smelled of papyrus and cedar oil, where scrolls lined the walls like sleeping serpents, each one holding mysteries waiting to be awakened. The old librarian, a gentle soul with hands stained by ink, would unroll these treasures for the young prince, showing him the beautiful letters marching across parchment like soldiers in formation. Here were the works of Homer, the deeds of Achilles and Odysseus, preserved in words that sang even when read in silence. Here were the teachings of the philosophers, questions about the nature of reality and truth and beauty, ideas that made the mind stretch like a cat waking from sleep. Alexander would spend hours in this sanctuary, the light from high windows moving across the floor as the sun traced its ancient path. Sometimes he would simply sit, breathing in the scent of old knowledge, feeling the presence of all those who had written these words, scribes long dead, but somehow still alive in every letter they had formed. The silence here was different from other silences, not empty, but full, pregnant with possibilities. And in this quietness, something grew in Alexander's young heart, a hunger not for conquest, but for understanding, a thirst not for glory, but for wisdom. He wanted to know everything, to understand the hidden patterns that connected all things, to see the world as the gods might see it, whole and beautiful and perfectly ordered. And this desire brought him peace, for it was infinite and thus could never disappoint. There would always be more to learn, more to discover, more to wonder at. The library became his true home, and knowledge his oldest friend. Then came the day that would shape all Alexander's days to follow. Word arrived that Aristotle, the great philosopher, student of Plato himself, had agreed to become the prince's tutor. Philip was elated, for this was a coup beyond any victory in battle, to have the finest mind in Greece teaching his son. A special place was prepared for their lessons, the grove of the nymphs at Mieza, away from the palace and its distractions. Here, ancient trees created a cathedral of green, their branches interlacing overhead like fingers clasped in prayer. A spring bubbled up from rocks, its water clear as air, cold as winter stars. The sound it made was like a continuous whisper, as if the earth itself were telling secrets. When Aristotle arrived, Alexander saw a man whose eyes held both kindness and penetrating intelligence, a philosopher who could discourse on the nature of the cosmos, but also appreciated the simple beauty of a wild flower growing by the path. Their lessons began gently, not with abstractions, but with observation. Aristotle would pick up a stone and ask Alexander to describe it, truly describe it, its weight and texture, the way light played across its surface, how it had been shaped by water over uncounted years. Every object held lessons. A bird's feather spoke of purpose and design. A seashell revealed mathematical perfection. The stars overhead followed patterns that both mind and cosmos seemed to share. And so Alexander learned to see, truly see, the world around him, not as a conqueror views territory to be taken, but as a philosopher contemplates truth to be understood. They spoke of ethics, of what makes an action good or just, of the responsibility that comes with power. Aristotle taught that a king must be first among citizens in virtue, that to rule others well, one must first rule oneself. These lessons sank deep, settling into Alexander's soul like stones dropped in still water, sending ripples that would spread across years. And in the cool shade of those ancient trees, with the spring singing its eternal song, the boy and the philosopher found a peace that belonged to both wisdom and friendship. The education at Mieza was not for Alexander alone. Philip sent other noble youths to study with Aristotle, sons of the great families of Macedonia, boys who would one day be generals and governors, companions in the truest sense. Among them was Hephaestion, tall and quiet, with eyes that saw deeply into hearts. From their first meeting, something passed between Alexander and this gentle soul, a recognition, as if they had known each other before. In some life previous to this one, they became inseparable, two halves of a whole, where Alexander was fire, Hephaestion was steady light, where Alexander spoke quickly, Hephaestion listened deeply. They would walk together through the grove after lessons, discussing everything Aristotle had taught, testing ideas against each other like sword blades being honed. But their sword was thought, and their battle was for truth. There were others too. Ptolemy with his quick laugh, Cassander who brooded but loved deeply, Clitus who was fierce in loyalty, Nearchus who dreamed of seas and ships. These boys became brothers, not of blood, but of something deeper. They shared their food and their fears, their ambitions and their doubts. In the evenings after study, they would gather by the spring, and someone would recite Homer from memory, the beautiful hexameters rolling out across the twilight, stories of friendships that transcended death, of Achilles and Patroclus, of bonds forged in war but proven in peace. And sitting there in that circle of friends, with the stars beginning to appear overhead like flowers blooming in an inverted garden, Alexander felt a completeness he had never known. This, this was wealth beyond counting. These friends who shared his mind and heart, and he understood in that moment that whatever came in future years, whatever victories or defeats, this time, these friends, this perfect circle of friendship would be the treasure he carried always. As the night deepened and their voices grew softer, eventually fading to companionable silence, the grove held them all in its ancient embrace, and everything was as it should be. Among all the lessons Aristotle taught, perhaps none captured Alexander's imagination more completely than the study of living things. The philosopher would lead his students through meadows and forests, teaching them to observe the intricate web that connected all life. You can imagine them there, moving slowly through tall grass, pausing to watch a spider weave its perfect web, each thread placed with geometrical precision. Alexander learned that the same patterns appeared everywhere in nature. The spiral of a seashell matched the spiral of certain flowers. The branching of trees mirrored the branching of rivers. Even lightning seemed to follow these eternal forms. Everything was connected. Everything flowed from the same divine source. Aristotle spoke of the prime mover, the original cause that set all else in motion, like a stone cast into still water, creating ripples that spread outward forever. And Alexander felt this truth in his bones, understood that he too was part of this great pattern, neither separate from the world nor master of it, but part of its flowing unity. They would spend entire afternoons by the stream, watching water striders dance on the surface, their delicate feet dimpling the water without breaking through. Tiny miracles of physics and faith. Dragonflies hovered nearby, their wings catching sunlight and scattering it like jewels thrown into air. And all of this, every cricket's song and bee's drone, every leaf that turned to follow the sun, was part of the same symphony, the same life force that moved in the plants, moved in the animals, and in Alexander himself. himself. When he placed his hand against the bark of an ancient oak, he felt the slow pulse of its life, patient and enduring. It had stood here before his grandfather was born, would stand here after his own grandchildren were dust, and yet the moment of connection, his hand on that rough bark, was eternal in its own way, a meeting between two lives, both temporary and both infinite. These lessons brought a serenity that settled over Alexander like morning dew, a recognition that everything was exactly as it needed to be, that the universe possessed an intelligence beyond human comprehension, but not beyond human appreciation. And in this knowledge, this deep biological and philosophical peace, he found rest. As the years at Mieza passed like water flowing over smooth stones, Alexander grew in both body and mind, reaching that threshold between boyhood and manhood where everything feels heightened, more vivid, as if the world itself were holding its breath. One spring morning, Aristotle led them to a high place overlooking the valley, where they could see the whole of Macedonia spread below like a living map. The mountains rose in the distance, still crowned with snow that caught the early light. The valley floor was a patchwork of fields, some plowed and dark, others green with new growth, and through it all wound the river, silver as mercury, catching the sun and scattering it back to the sky. Here, Aristotle spoke of perspective, how the same thing appears different when viewed from different heights. From down in the valley, the mountains seemed insurmountable, but from up here, they were simply part of a larger whole. So too with life. When we are caught in our immediate concerns, they seem overwhelming, but when we rise above them through philosophy and reason, we see they are but small parts of a much grander design. Alexander sat very still, feeling the cool morning air on his face, watching mist rise from the valley like the breath of the sleeping earth. He thought about all he had learned, all the books he had read, all the conversations that had shaped his mind, and he understood that education was not just accumulation of facts, but transformation of self. The boy who had entered this grove was not the same person who sat here now. Knowledge had changed him, philosophy had deepened him, friendship had completed him. Yet there was no sense of ending, only of beginning. For now, the real lessons would start, the lessons that life itself would teach. He would leave Mieza soon, return to the world of action and consequence, but he would carry this place with him always, the grove and the spring, the friends and the teacher, the peace that came from understanding. These were not things left behind, but integrated, made part of who he was, like a river that has passed through many landscapes, gathering waters from countless streams. He had been shaped by all he encountered and was now ready to flow onward toward whatever ocean awaited. And in this readiness, this openness to becoming, there was profound peace. The final days at Mieza had a bittersweet quality, like autumn when the leaves are most beautiful precisely because they are about to fall. Alexander and his companions knew their time in the sanctuary was ending, that the demands of the world would soon claim them. But there was no sadness in this, only gratitude for what had been, and quiet excitement for what might be. On their last evening, they gathered one final time by the spring, and Aristotle spoke to them not as students, but as friends. He told them that everything he had taught was merely a beginning, that the real wisdom would come from living, from facing challenges with virtue, from remaining true to the principle they had learned, even when doing so was difficult. He reminded them that knowledge without compassion was tyranny, that power without justice was oppression, that victory without mercy was hollow. He asked them to remember that every person they would meet, from the highest king to the lowest servant, carried the same divine spark, possessed the same fundamental humanity. To rule justly meant to see this truth always, to never let power blind them to the essential equality of all souls. As he spoke, the spring sang its eternal song. The trees stirred in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began its evening hymn. The moment held a quality of timelessness, as if past and future collapsed into an eternal now, as if all the lessons learned here were not sequential but simultaneous, all present in this single moment of understanding. When Aristotle finished speaking, there was a long silence, not awkward but full. Each boy sat with his own thoughts, his own gratitude, his own quiet determination to live up to what they had been given here. Then Alexander stood, and one by one the others joined him, and they clasped hands in a circle around the spring, making promises without words. You could see it in their faces, lit by the last of the daylight. A solemnity and a joy mingled together. These were the bonds that would sustain them through everything that was to come. And as the stars appeared overhead, one by one, like flowers blooming in that vast garden, the circle of friends simply stood, breathing together, being together, knowing that this moment, this perfect crystalline moment, would live in memory forever. And in that knowing, that gratitude for what was and what would be, came the deepest rest of all. Alexander returned to Pella a different person than the boy who had left. His limbs had lengthened, his voice had deepened, but the greatest changes were invisible, written in his mind and heart. The palace felt both familiar and strange, like a childhood memory, half remembered. The marble halls echoed with his footsteps as they always had, but now he heard in that sound a reminder of impermanence, of how all things pass. Even stone eventually crumbles. He sought out his father and found him in the war room, surrounded by maps and messengers. The cares of kingship sat heavily on Philip's shoulders. Yet, when he saw his son, his face softened with pride. They spoke long into the night, and Philip was amazed at how Aristotle had shaped the boy's thinking. Here was not just a prince, but a philosopher, not just a warrior in training, but a student of virtue. In the days that followed, Alexander began to attend council meetings, sitting quietly at first, observing how his father governed, how he balanced the competing interests of nobles and common folk, how he decided when to show mercy and when justice demanded firmness. These were lessons no scroll could teach. Philip would sometimes turn to his son and ask his opinion, and Alexander would answer thoughtfully, drawing on Aristotle's teachings but tempering them with practical wisdom. The old courtiers began to look at the young prince with new eyes, seeing in him the qualities of a future king, not distant and unapproachable, but present and engaged, someone who listened before speaking, who considered before deciding. In the quiet hours, Alexander would walk the palace gardens where fountains played their eternal songs and flowers bloomed in careful arrangements. He thought of Mesa and missed the grove, but understood that every season has its place. Those days of pure learning were complete. Now came the season of applying what he had learned, and there was peace in this acceptance, in understanding that growth meant leaving some things behind while carrying their essence forward. The gardens at twilight became his meditation, where he could be alone with the eternal rhythm of water and breeze, and remember that despite the complexities of court, despite the weight of expectations, the same patterns that govern the stars governed human life, and all would unfold as it must. One day, a horse dealer arrived at court, a Thessalian who brought with him a magnificent black stallion. The horse was wild, rearing and snorting, eyes rolling white with fear and fury. The dealer quoted an enormous price, and Philip was intrigued. The beast was clearly of exceptional bloodlines, powerful and proud, but no one could approach it, not the master of horse, nor the most experienced grooms. It bucked and kicked, dangerous as a storm. Philip grew frustrated and ordered the horse taken away. It was then that Alexander spoke, quietly but with certainty. "Let me try." The court fell silent. Philip began to object. The risk was too great, but something in his son's eyes stopped him. A knowing, a strange confidence. Alexander walked toward the stallion slowly, speaking in a low, melodic voice. He had noticed what others had not. The horse feared its own shadow, was terrified by the darkness that followed it across the ground. With careful movements, Alexander turned the stallion to face the sun, so its shadow fell behind it. The horse's ears pricked forward, its breathing slowed. Alexander continued to speak, soft meaningless words that carried only tone, only calm, only reassurance. He reached up and stroked the great neck, felt the power trembling beneath velvet skin, felt the wild heart gradually steadying. Then, in one fluid motion, he vaulted onto the horse's back. There was a collective gasp from the watchers, but the stallion did not rear. Instead, it stood quivering, then began to walk, then trot, and finally, as Alexander gave it its head, it galloped, racing across the field with hooves that seemed to barely touch the earth. Joy surged through Alexander. This was flight. This was freedom. This was perfect unity between human and beast. When he finally returned, Philip had tears in his eyes. He embraced his son and said words Alexander would remember always. My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you. They named the horse Bucephalus, meaning ox head, for the breadth of its skull. And from that day forward, he was Alexander's shadow, his companion, his brother in four-legged form. The bond between them was so deep that others marveled at it. How horse and rider seemed to think with one mind, move with one will. And in the evenings, Alexander would visit the stables, brush Bucephalus's gleaming coat, speak to him of the day's events, finding in the horse's dark eyes an understanding that needed no words. This too was love, different from friendship, but equally precious, and in it, as in all forms of connection, there was abiding peace. As Alexander entered his 16th year, Philip began to give him real responsibilities, not ceremonial duties, but actual governance. There were disputes to settle between neighboring villages, questions of water rights and boundary lines, matters that might seem small but affected people's lives deeply. Alexander approached each case with the seriousness it deserved. He would ride out to the disputed sites, speak with both parties, walk the land himself to understand the lay of it. He remembered Aristotle's teachings about justice, that it must balance many considerations: what is fair, what is practical, what serves the greater good. One case involved two farmers arguing over an olive grove that lay between their properties. Each claimed his grandfather had planted the trees. Each insisted the other was lying. Alexander asked them to show him the oldest tree. When they did, he examined it carefully, noting how its roots spread, how its branches reached. Then he asked to see the boundary stones. When he had seen all he needed to see, he made his judgment. The grove would be shared, the harvest divided equally, and both men would tend it together. At first, they protested, but Alexander explained that the trees cared nothing for human claims of ownership. They simply grew, offering shade and fruit to whoever sat beneath their branches. The land had been there before either family, would be there after both were gone. The trees were teachers, showing that abundance need not be divided by conflict but multiplied by cooperation. The farmers looked at each other, and something shifted. They saw the young prince's wisdom, and more, they saw their own foolishness in fighting over what might better be shared. Within a month, they had become friends, working the grove together and finding the harvest richer for their collaboration. Word of such judgments spread, and people began to speak of Alexander not just as Philip's son, but as someone who might one day be a great king in his own right. But Alexander took no pride in this. He saw each case as an opportunity to practice what he had learned, to test the theories of philosophy against the realities of human life. And in the quiet of his chambers at night, he would reflect on the day's decisions, wondering if he had judged rightly, asking himself how he might have done better. This habit of reflection, of always questioning, always learning, became his greatest teacher, and in it he found not anxiety but peace, for he knew that growth was a journey without end, that becoming wise was a process that would last his whole life, and there was no shame in not having arrived, only joy in continuing to travel. The seasons continued their ancient dance, spring giving way to summer, summer fading into autumn, and with each turning, Alexander grew more capable, more confident, yet also more humble, for he saw how much there was still to learn. Philip continued to expand Macedonia's influence, forging alliances, settling old grievances, slowly building something that might one day rival the great powers of the South. Athens, with its philosophy and theatre, Thebes, with its undefeated sacred band, Sparta, with its warrior tradition. The Greek cities were like brilliant stars, each shining with its own light, but scattered, never unified, never speaking with one voice. Philip dreamed of changing that, of bringing harmony where there had been only competition, and Alexander watched his father work toward this vision, saw how he wove together military skill and diplomatic finesse, how a gift sent at the right time could accomplish what 1,000 soldiers could not, how patience sometimes was the greatest weapon. In the evenings, father and son would often dine together, just the two of them, and Philip would share his thoughts about the future. He spoke of Persia, the vast empire to the east that had invaded Greece in his grandfather's time. How the Persian king ruled over more people than there were grains of sand on a beach, commanded wealth beyond imagination. But Philip also spoke of Persian weaknesses, how the empire was so large it could not be governed efficiently, how its army relied on mercenaries who fought for gold rather than love of country. These conversations planted seeds in Alexander's mind, ideas that would grow and bloom in years to come. But for now, they were simply a father and son, sharing wine and bread, talking of dreams and strategies. finding in each other's company a rare ease. For all their differences, all the ways they viewed the world through different lenses, there was deep love between them, the kind that needs no declaration, that exists in shared silences and knowing glances. In these quiet hours, when the palace slept and only candles kept watch, when the affairs of state could be set aside, and they were simply two people connected by blood and affection, there was a peace that belonged to neither power nor glory, but to something older and more fundamental, the bond between parent and child, the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next, the eternal rhythm of age making way for youth, while youth learned from age. And in this rhythm, this ancient pattern, there was profound rest. When Alexander turned 16, Philip made a decision that surprised the court. He needed to campaign in the south to bring rebellious cities back into alliance, and in his absence, he named Alexander regent, effectively placing the young prince in charge of all Macedonia. Some of the old nobles grumbled, questioning whether one so young could handle such responsibility. But Philip silenced their doubts with a look. He had watched his son, tested him, and found him ready. The day Philip rode south with the army, Alexander stood on the palace walls and watched until the dust of their passing had settled. Then he turned to the work before him. He called a council and spoke to them simply. He was young, yes, he had much to learn, but he would do his utmost to govern justly and wisely. He asked for their patience and their guidance. This humility won them over more than any show of authority could have. Here was a prince who understood that leadership meant service, not domination. For weeks, all was peaceful. The harvests came in, disputes were settled, the kingdom functioned as it always had. But then, word arrived of trouble in the north. Thracian tribes were raiding Macedonian settlements, taking advantage of Philip's absence to test the young regent. The nobles looked to Alexander, wondering what he would do. A lesser ruler might have panicked, might have called for Philip's return. But Alexander remembered what Aristotle had taught him about courage, that it was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He assembled a small force, not the full army, but enough to send a message. He led them north himself, riding Bucephalus at the head of the column, and as they rode through the mountain passes, breathing the clear cold air, seeing the peaks rise around them like ancient sentinels, Alexander felt something stirring in his chest. This was the life he had been born for, not sitting in council chambers, but leading, acting, being part of the great flow of history. Yet there was no bloodlust in his heart, no desire for violence, only the calm determination to protect those who depended on him, to restore peace so that farmers could work their fields and children could play without fear. The ride itself was a meditation, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, the creak of leather, the breathing of horses and men moving together toward toward a common purpose. And in this unity of action, this clarity of mission, Alexander found a peace deeper than contemplation, the peace that comes from being fully present, fully committed, fully alive. The Thracian raiders were not expecting a response so swift, nor a force led by the young prince himself. When Alexander's scouts located their camp, he did not rush to attack. Instead, he sent envoys, offering them a choice: return what they had taken and cease raiding, or face consequences. The Thracian chiefs laughed at first. What could this boy do? But when they saw the disciplined Macedonian force arrayed on the plain, saw the young commander sitting tall on his magnificent black horse, confidence radiating from him like heat from a forge, they reconsidered. Alexander had positioned his forces carefully, not to intimidate, but to demonstrate. These were professional soldiers, each man in his place, each weapon gleaming in the sun, moving with a precision that spoke of endless training, and at their head, a prince who looked like he had been born in the saddle. The Thracian chiefs conferred among themselves. They were raiders, not soldiers. They loved the thrill of the swift strike and quick retreat, but had no stomach for pitched battle against such an opponent. They agreed to Alexander's terms, returning the stolen goods, swearing to keep the peace. Alexander accepted their oath with grace, offering them trade instead of conflict, suggesting that prosperity through commerce was superior to poverty through war. When he returned to Pella, the court erupted in celebration. A 16-year-old boy had solved a military crisis without bloodshed, had shown both strength and mercy, had embodied exactly the principles Aristotle had taught. Philip heard of it in the south and sent word, 5 words, that Alexander treasured. Well done, my son. In the quiet that followed, Alexander reflected on what had happened. He had been afraid, more afraid than he would admit to anyone save Hephaestion. But fear had not paralyzed him, had not clouded his judgment. He had acknowledged it, accepted it, and then acted despite it. This, he understood, was what Aristotle meant by courage, and in this understanding he found not pride but gratitude for the education that had prepared him, for the companions who stood with him, for the universe that had placed him exactly where he needed to be, to learn exactly what he needed to learn. The evening settled over Pella like a soft blanket, bringing with it the cool air of autumn, the scent of wood smoke from 1,000 hearths, the sound of laughter from the guards, and Alexander stood on the walls, watching the first stars appear, feeling profoundly at peace, not because he had won, but because he had been tested and found himself equal to the test. This was what it meant to become. 2 years passed like pages turning in a book, each season bringing new lessons, new growth. Alexander was 18 now, no longer a boy, but not yet fully a man, existing in that liminal space where the future beckons, but the past still holds. Philip's campaigns in the south had borne fruit. Most of the Greek cities had acknowledged Macedonian supremacy, though Athens remained proud and distant, speaking eloquently of freedom while never quite committing to open rebellion. But Thebes, sacred Thebes, with its undefeated sacred band, remained defiant. These warriors, 300 pairs of lovers who fought side by side, had never lost a battle. They were legend incarnate, the finest soldiers Greece had ever produced. Philip knew that Greece could not truly be unified while Thebes held out, and so he marched south once more, and this time Alexander marched with him, not as a boy watching from the sidelines, but as a commander in his own right, given charge of the companion cavalry, the elite mounted force that was the hammer to the phalanx's anvil. The armies met at Cheronea, on a plain that had witnessed battles since time immemorial. The day was clear, the sky impossibly blue, as if the gods themselves had polished it for this moment. Alexander sat on Bucephalus, feeling the horse's steady strength beneath him, looking at the enemy line stretching across the field. He felt no hatred for these men. They were defending what they saw as freedom, following the same honorable path he might have followed had he been born Theban. But destiny had made him Macedonian, and his duty was clear. Philip's plan was complex, requiring perfect timing and absolute trust. The phalanx would feign retreat, drawing the Thebans forward, and then, at the crucial moment, Alexander would lead the cavalry in a charge that would shatter their flank. Everything depended on patience, on waiting for exactly the right instant. The battle began, and war revealed itself to be nothing like the stories. It was chaos and noise, dust and confusion, the screaming of horses and men, the clash of bronze on bronze. But through it all, Alexander kept his focus, watching, waiting, trusting his father's plan, even as every instinct screamed at him to charge. Then the moment came. The Theban line shifted, exposing its flank. Philip raised his hand, and Alexander gave Bucephalus his head. The cavalry surged forward like a wave of iron and flesh, Alexander at their front, and something in him, some part that had never been awakened before, rose to meet the moment. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat lasting an age. He could see everything, feel everything, and there was no fear, only perfect clarity, only the absolute certainty of action. The sacred band fought with magnificent courage, but they were outflanked, surrounded. Eventually, they fell, all 300 of them, dying where they stood, refusing to retreat. And when it was over, when silence settled over the field like ash, Alexander rode among the fallen, looking at their faces, young men like himself, who would never see another sunrise, never feel the wind or taste wine or laugh with friends, and whatever exaltation he had felt in battle drained away, replaced by profound sorrow. This too was war, not glory, but grief, not triumph, but tragedy. He ordered that the sacred band be buried with full honors as warriors deserving of respect. And that night, alone in his tent, he wept for what had been lost, for the terrible price of victory, for the knowledge that this was what his life would be. After Chaeronea, Greece changed. Philip called a great congress at Corinth, inviting representatives from all the city-states. Even Athens sent delegates, though they came reluctantly, their pride wounded, but their pragmatism intact. Alexander attended as his father's right hand, sitting in council with men who had been famous when he was still in swaddling clothes. Demosthenes, the great orator, Phocion the general, Aeschines the diplomat. These were the voices that had shaped Greek politics for decades, and they were wary of Macedonia, seeing it as a threat to the freedoms their ancestors had died to preserve. But Philip surprised them. He did not demand surrender or tribute. Instead, he proposed something unprecedented: a league of Greek states, with Macedonia as its leader, yes, but with each city retaining its autonomy, its own laws and customs, united not through conquest, but through common purpose. And that purpose, Philip announced, would be the invasion of Persia, revenge for the invasions of Xerxes and Darius, liberation of the Greek cities enslaved in Asia Minor, glory and wealth for all who participated. The room erupted in debate. Some saw through Philip's rhetoric to the naked ambition beneath. Others were seduced by the vision, by the idea that Greece might finally act as one, might accomplish something worthy of its heroes. Alexander listened to all of it, storing away insights, learning how different men responded to the same proposal based on their fears and hopes. He saw that politics was psychology, that understanding what people wanted was half the battle, and he saw something else, a shadow behind his father's eyes, a knowledge that this grand plan might not see completion in Philip's lifetime, that the role of conqueror might fall to the son. The thought did not thrill him, as it might have once. After Cheronia, after seeing what war truly meant, the prospect of leading armies across the known world felt less like adventure and more like burden. But he said nothing, only listened and learned, storing up wisdom against the day when he might need it. As night fell over Corinth and the delegates retired to their quarters, still arguing, Alexander walked alone through the ancient city. The stones beneath his feet had been worn smooth by countless footsteps. These streets had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had heard prophecies and prayers in equal measure. Everything was temporary, every glory eventually dust, and yet people persisted in striving, in building, in trying to leave something behind. He thought of Aristotle's teachings about potentiality and actuality, how everything contained within it the possibility of what it might become. He was potential, standing on the threshold of actuality. What would he make of the life given to him? What would he become? These were questions without easy answers, but somehow, in asking them, in holding them gently, rather than demanding immediate resolution, he found peace. The journey mattered more than the destination, the becoming more than the arrival. And under the stars that had witnessed everything human civilization had ever accomplished, Alexander breathed deeply and accepted both his fear and his fate. The months that followed Corinth were filled with preparation. Philip began assembling the greatest army Greece had ever seen: Macedonian phalanx and Thessalian cavalry, Cretan archers and Thracian light troops, mercenaries from every corner of the Greek world, drawn by the promise of Persian gold. Alexander threw himself into these preparations, working alongside his father, learning logistics and strategy, how to feed an army of such magnitude, how to move it across difficult terrain, how to keep morale high and discipline strong. But in quieter moments, he made time for philosophy. He corresponded with Aristotle, writing long letters about what he had witnessed at Cheronea, asking whether violence in pursuit of justice could truly be just, whether the means could be separated from the ends. Aristotle's responses were thoughtful and nuanced. He did not offer easy answers, but rather taught Alexander to think through the complexities, to recognize that most situations held multiple truths in tension with each other. War was terrible, yes, but sometimes necessary to prevent greater terrors. Power corrupted, yes, but the absence of power could lead to chaos. The task was not to avoid these contradictions, but to navigate them with wisdom and virtue, to remain conscious always of the weight of one's choices, to rule not for personal glory, but for the welfare of those entrusted to one's care. These letters became Alexander's greatest education, tempering his youthful certainty with mature complexity. He also grew closer to his companions. Those who had studied with him at Mieza were now his officers. Hephaestion commanded cavalry, Ptolemy led infantry, Nearchus was learning naval warfare. They were becoming the men they would be, and their friendship deepened as shared responsibility bound them together. They would gather in the evenings, when the day's work was done, and speak not of war, but of what they remembered: the grove at Mieza, the sound of the spring, Aristotle's patient voice explaining how the world worked. Those memories were precious beyond gold, a reminder of who they had been before duty and destiny reshaped them. And sometimes they would fall silent, simply sitting together, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, finding in companionship something that required no words. These were the moments Alexander treasured most, when the weight of expectation lifted and he was simply himself among friends. when laughter came easily and the future felt distant rather than imminent. In such moments, time seemed to pause, to gather itself like water behind a dam, and everything was exactly as it should be. No past to regret, no future to fear, only the present, eternal and sufficient. And in that eternal present, there was peace beyond measure. But before the great expedition could begin, tragedy came like a thief in the night. Philip, victorious Philip, beloved Philip, fell to an assassin's blade at his daughter's wedding. The celebration became catastrophe in a heartbeat, music turning to screams, joy to horror. Alexander had been across the hall when it happened. He pushed through the panicking crowd, knowing already what he would find, seeing it anyway. His father's body on the marble floor, blood pooling around him, eyes still open, but seeing nothing. The world tilted, became strange, as if this were a dream from which he might wake. But it was not a dream. It was terrible reality, irreversible and absolute. The guards seized the assassin, but questions remained. Who had paid him? Who had planned this? Was it revenge for some old slight, or political calculation by those who feared Macedonian power? In the chaos that followed, Alexander had to become what he had never wanted to be, had to step into his father's enormous shadow and prove he could fill it. He was 20 years old. The nobles looked at him with doubt. Some plotted to replace him with an older, more malleable candidate. But Alexander moved swiftly, calling an assembly, speaking with a confidence he did not truly feel, claiming his inheritance by right of birth and by merit. He invoked his father's memory, promised to complete Philip's vision, to lead Greece against Persia, to bring honor to Macedonia, and slowly the doubt receded. These hard men, veterans of countless campaigns, looked into the young king's eyes and saw something there, not inexperience, but purpose, not youth, but potential, ready to become actual. The army acclaimed him, shouting his name, clashing their weapons against their shields in approval. That night, alone in the royal chambers that were now his, Alexander allowed himself to grieve. He wept for his father, for conversations they would never have, for lessons still unlearned, for the loss of the one person who had known him longest and loved him most unconditionally. But grief, he discovered, was not the opposite of strength. It was simply love transformed, the price paid for having cared deeply, and in accepting this, in allowing himself to feel fully both the pain and the gratitude, he found that he could carry it, could bear this weight, because it connected him to something larger than himself. His father lived on in him, in the values taught and the vision shared, in every decision made with wisdom rather than haste, in every moment of mercy granted when vengeance might have been easier. Philip's legacy was not conquest, but cultivation, not what he had taken, but what he had built. And that legacy, that trust, passed now to Alexander, and strange as it seemed, in accepting this tremendous burden, in saying yes to destiny despite its terrifying weight, Alexander found unexpected peace, not the peace of safety, but the peace of purpose, not the peace of certainty, but the peace of commitment. He stood at the threshold of his future and stepped forward into glory and shadow both, into everything he had been prepared for, and so much he could never have imagined. And the stars looked down, as they always had, patient and eternal, witnessing another turning of fate's wheel. The first challenge came swiftly. Word reached Pella that the Greek cities were stirring, testing whether this young king could hold what his father had won. Thebes, ever defiant Thebes, raised rebellion openly, claiming that Alexander was too young, too inexperienced, that Macedonia's supremacy had died with Philip. Alexander faced a choice that would define his reign: show weakness now and spend years fighting rebellions, or act decisively and make clear that the son was every bit his father's equal. He marched south with terrible speed, covering the distance so quickly that Thebes had no time to prepare proper defenses. The city walls loomed before his army, ancient and proud, but Alexander felt no satisfaction in what must come, only grim necessity. He offered terms, generous terms: submit peacefully, and no harm would come. But the Thebans remembered their sacred band, remembered Cheronia, and pride would not let them bend. So the city fell, not easily, but inevitably. And Alexander, remembering Aristotle's teachings about justice tempered with mercy, made a decision that shocked his generals. He spared the temples, spared the priests, even spared the house where the poet Pindar had lived, because art and spirit deserved preservation, even when the city that housed them did not. But the rest became an example, a message written in stone and ash. This is what comes of defying the king of Macedonia. The other Greek cities received that message clearly. Athens sent ambassadors bearing olive branches. Sparta maintained its aloof neutrality, but made no move toward rebellion. Greece had a new master, young but unyielding, and Alexander returned to Macedonia, carrying the weight of what he had done. Necessary, perhaps, but still heavy. The nights were hardest, when he would wake from dreams of burning cities and wonder if this was who he was meant to become. But Hephaestion was there, as always, asking no questions, simply present. And in that quiet presence, Alexander found the strength to continue, to accept that leadership sometimes demanded terrible choices, that being king meant bearing burdens others could not. He thought of his father, wished desperately he could ask Philip's advice, But some journeys must be walked alone, some wisdom gained only through experience. And so Alexander learned and grew and became, day by day, choice by choice, transforming from prince into king, from potential into reality. And in the quiet moments, watching dawn break over Macedonia, seeing the mountains emerge from shadow into light, he found that transformation was not abandonment of self, but discovery of hidden depths, not becoming someone else, but becoming more fully himself. And in this becoming, despite its pain and difficulty, there was strange peace with Greece secure. Alexander could finally turn toward the vision his father had died before completing: the invasion of Persia, the great campaign that would either make him immortal or end his story before it truly began. The preparations were immense, not just gathering an army, but organizing supplies for a campaign that might last years. Grain and wine, weapons and armor, tents and pack animals, everything multiplied by thousands. The treasury was nearly empty. Philip had spent lavishly on his wars, and Alexander had no gold to spare. So he did something unexpected. He gave away what little he had, granting estates to his generals, distributing his personal wealth among those who would follow him. When someone asked what he was keeping for himself, he answered simply, hope. This gesture, this faith in the future, rather than security in the present, inspired the army profoundly. If their king was willing to risk everything, how could they do less? The fleet gathered at the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Alexander stood on the deck of the lead ship, watching the Asian shore grow closer. He thought of all the heroes who had crossed before him: Achilles sailing to Troy, the 10,000 marching home from Persian lands. This water had witnessed so much history, and now it would witness his crossing too. As they approached the shore, Alexander did something no one expected. He hurled his spear into the Asian beach, claiming the land as a gift from the gods. Then he leapt into the shallows, the first to touch Asian soil, and waded ashore. Behind him, the army followed: 30,000 soldiers and 5,000 cavalry, the greatest expedition Greece had ever mounted. They marched first to Troy, that ancient city whose ruins still spoke of glory and tragedy intermingled. Alexander made sacrifice at the tomb of Achilles, his hero, whose life he had studied since childhood. Achilles, who had chosen a short life of fame over a long life of obscurity. Alexander understood that choice now, felt it in his bones. He was 22 years old, standing at the beginning of everything. The Asian wind touched his face, warm and strange, carrying scents of unknown flowers, speaking of lands he had never seen, peoples he had never met, and fear and excitement mingled so thoroughly he could not distinguish between them. This was the threshold. Once crossed, There would be no turning back, no safety in retreat, only forward into glory or death, or most likely both. But he did not hesitate, did not doubt. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Every lesson from Aristotle, every conversation with Philip, every challenge overcome had been leading here. And so he stepped forward into his destiny, as behind him the army made camp, and smoke from cooking fires rose into the twilight sky, and someone started singing an old Macedonian song about home and heroes, and the stars emerged, one by one, patient witnesses to all human striving, all human hoping, watching as they had watched Troy burn, watching as civilizations rose and fell, watching now as a young king began the journey that would echo through all the ages yet to come. The Persian response came at a river called the Granicus, where the satraps of the western provinces had gathered their forces. A careful general would have waited, given his army time to rest, found better ground. But Alexander saw opportunity and seized it. The Persians held the far bank, their cavalry arrayed in glittering splendor, armor of gold and silver catching the afternoon light. They looked invincible, magnificent, terrifying. Alexander's generals counseled caution. Wait until morning. Find a ford. But Alexander saw something they did not. Saw that surprise was worth more than perfect preparation. That audacity could accomplish what caution never would. And so, as the sun began its descent, he ordered the attack. The river ran swift and cold, horses tumbling on slick stones, men struggling to keep formation in water that reached their waists. The Persians rained javelins and arrows down on them, and soldiers began to fall. But Alexander was at the front, always at the front. Impossibility seemed his element. He drove Bucephalus forward, the great horse surging through the current, and behind him, inspired by their king's courage, the Macedonians pushed on. The fighting on the far bank was desperate, close, and brutal. Alexander found himself surrounded. His helmet was struck, his sword broken. A Persian noble aimed a blow that would have killed him. But Cleitus, faithful Cleitus, cut the man down first, saving Alexander's life as he had saved it before. And then, as suddenly as it began, the Persian line broke. Their satraps had fought bravely, but they were not professional soldiers. They were administrators playing at war. And when the cost grew too high, they fled. The victory was complete, sudden, almost unbelievable. Alexander's first battle as king had ended in triumph. But that night, sitting by the fire, touching the dent in his helmet where death had come so close, Alexander felt not exultation, but wonder. He had survived, truly survived, when so easily he might not have. Life suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. Each breath a gift, each moment borrowed from fate. He walked among the camp, visiting the wounded, speaking quietly with those who were dying, holding their hands as they slipped away. These men had followed him, had trusted him, and some had paid the final price. Their sacrifice demanded that he be worthy of it, that he use this victory not for personal glory, but for something larger, something that might justify the cost. And in the dark hours before dawn, when the camp finally slept and only sentries kept watch, Alexander sat alone, looking at the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. He thought of Aristotle's teachings about the unmoved mover, the original cause that set everything in motion, and he wondered if perhaps he was not moving through his own will alone, but was himself being moved, a piece in some vast pattern too large to comprehend. The thought brought strange comfort. If he was part of something larger, then success and failure both had meaning beyond his personal fate. Then he could simply do his best, act with virtue and wisdom, and trust that the outcome would be what it needed to be. And in that trust, that surrender to forces beyond his control, he found the deepest peace he had known since his father's death. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of acceptance. Not the peace of safety, but the peace of purpose. And slowly, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Alexander's eyes finally closed, and he slept. After Granicus, the coastal cities of Asia Minor opened their gates, some out of fear, some out of calculation, a few out of genuine hope that this young conqueror might truly be different from those who had come before. Alexander treated each city according to its response. Those who had resisted found him implacable. Those who submitted found him merciful. He began to develop a pattern that would define his rule. He preserved local customs and laws, left existing administrators in place when they were competent, asked only for loyalty and tribute. Greece and Persia were not so different after all. Farmers tilled the same earth, merchants traded the same goods, mothers sang the same lullabies to children who would grow up never knowing why their grandfathers had fought. In the city of Ephesus, Alexander visited the great temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the world. He stood in its vast columned hall, looking up at architecture that seemed to defy gravity, and felt humbled. These people had been building temples when his ancestors were still tribal chiefs, had developed philosophy and mathematics while Macedonia was still finding its footing. Conquest was one thing, but could he truly claim to be civilizing people who had civilization when Greece was young? The question troubled him. At night, he would write to Aristotle, describing what he saw: the vastness of the Persian Empire, the diversity of its peoples, the complexity of its administration, and Aristotle would write back, reminding him that justice was universal, that good governance looked the same whether in Athens or Persepolis, that the measure of a ruler was not what he conquered, but what he built. These letters kept Alexander grounded, reminded him why he was doing this, or tried to remind him, for in honest moments he was no longer sure himself why he continued. Momentum, perhaps, because stopping would mean all the deaths had been for nothing. Destiny, perhaps, because some part of him still believed he had been born for this, or simply because he did not know what else to do, had trained his entire life for conquest and knew no other path. But doubt was not something a king could show, so in public he was confidence itself, radiating certainty and purpose, while in private, alone with his thoughts, he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The spring nights in Asia were warm, soft with the scent of flowers that did not grow in Macedonia. Alexander would sometimes sit outside his tent, listening to the camp settle into sleep, the murmur of guards changing shifts, the occasional whinny of a horse, the eternal song of crickets that sounded the same whether in Europe or Asia. And in these quiet moments, he would remember simpler times, the grove at Mieza, his father's laughter, his mother's fierce love, all the pieces of himself he had left behind in pursuit of glory. Were they lost forever, or simply waiting, patient as the stars, for the day when he might return? If he returned, the question hung in the air like incense, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. But somehow, in sitting with the uncertainty, in acknowledging both his doubts and his determination, Alexander found he could bear it, could carry both the weight of command and the weight of question, could be simultaneously the confident king his army needed and the uncertain young man he still was inside. And in this dual existence, this holding of contradictions without demanding resolution, there was, strange as it seemed, peace. Word came that Darius himself, the great king, the king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India, was gathering an army, not a provincial force like at Granicus, but the full might of Persia. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, cavalry beyond counting, war chariots and elephants, everything the vast empire could muster. The army heard this news with mixed feelings. Fear, yes, for they were far from home facing impossible odds, but also, strangely, relief. This would be the test, the moment when everything would be decided. Win and the empire might fall, lose, and they would never see Macedonia again. Alexander called his generals to council, spread maps across the table, discussed strategy and logistics, where to meet Darius, how to use their smaller numbers as advantage. His voice was calm, his manner confident, but afterward, when the others had left, He stood alone, looking at those maps, at the vast distances marked on parchment, at the tiny symbols representing armies and cities, and he thought how strange it was that the fate of so many should hang on the decisions of so few, that his choices in the next weeks might echo through centuries, reshape the world for generations unborn. The weight of it was almost unbearable, and yet he had to bear it, had to stand tomorrow before his army and radiate certainty, had to make decisions that would send men to their deaths, had to carry the hopes and fears of thousands who had no choice but to trust him. Hephaestion found him there, as sunset painted the world in shades of gold, and without speaking, simply stood beside him. Sometimes friendship needed no words, only presence, only the knowledge that you are not alone. That night, Alexander dreamed of his father. Philip stood in the grove at Mieza, young and whole, smiling the way he had before war and politics carved lines into his face. He put his hand on Alexander's shoulder and said simply, "You are ready." Alexander woke with tears on his face, but also peace in his heart. He was ready, or as ready as he would ever be. The lessons had been learned, the preparation complete. Now came only the doing. And in the days that followed, as the army marched toward its rendezvous with destiny, Alexander felt himself settling into a strange calm. Fear had exhausted itself. Doubt had said all it had to say. What remained was simply clarity. The path ahead was clear. He would meet Darius, would face the Persian host, and whatever happened would happen. He had done his best, led as wisely as he knew how, loved his friends, and honored his teachers. The outcome was no longer his to control, only his to meet. And in this surrender, this acceptance of fate, there came a lightness he had not felt in months. The burden remained, but he was no longer crushed by it. He could carry it with grace, even with joy. For this was his purpose, this was his gift, to stand between his people and the storm. And if the storm took him, well, Achilles had chosen the same, and the story had remembered Achilles for 3,000 years. Some things were worth dying for. Some moments justified the cost. As the sun set on the eve of battle, Alexander stood before his army and spoke words that would echo through history, words of courage and fate and glory. But in his heart, he spoke simpler words, words only he could hear. Thank you for this life, for these friends, for this moment. However it ends, it has been enough. The Battle of Issus unfolded like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, depending on where you stood. The Persian army was so vast it seemed to cover the earth. Their numbers were overwhelming, truly overwhelming. But Alexander had chosen his ground carefully, a narrow coastal plain where numbers meant less than skill, where the vast Persian host became its own obstacle. The battle began at dawn, with light streaming over the mountains, painting everything in shades of rose and gold. And Alexander, as always, led from the front, driving straight toward the center where Darius stood in his magnificent chariot. If Granicus had been desperate, Issus was controlled fury. The phalanx advanced like a wall of bronze and iron, unstoppable, inevitable, and Alexander's cavalry struck like lightning, shattering the Persian line, and Darius, seeing the Macedonian king driving directly toward him, surrounded by elite guards who fell one by one, lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled the field, leaving his army leaderless. The Persian soldiers, brave as they were, could not fight without leadership. The battle became a rout. By evening, it was over. Alexander stood on a field strewn with the dead of both armies. Victory absolute, almost unbelievable. He had defeated the great king himself, had sent Darius fleeing. The empire lay open before him, but there was no joy in Alexander's heart as he rode among the fallen, only profound sadness. How many mothers would weep? How many children grow up fatherless? How many wives become widows? All because of this day. Victory felt hollow, tasted of ash. The Persian camp was captured intact, and Alexander found within it Darius's family, his mother, his wife, his children. They fell to their knees, expecting death or slavery. But Alexander raised them gently, called them by royal titles, promised they would be treated with all honor. He saw in their terrified faces the same humanity he saw everywhere, the same capacity for fear and love, the same spark of divinity. And he understood that these people were not his enemies. They had never been. They were simply caught in the machinery of empire, in the great turning of history's wheel. That night, surrounded by the celebrations of his victorious army, their songs of triumph echoing across the plain, Alexander sat alone in his tent. He thought of all that had brought him to this moment: his father's dreams, Aristotle's teachings, the friends who had stood beside him, the soldiers who had followed him into the impossible and made it real. And he thought about what came next. Darius would gather another army. The empire was vast and rich. This victory was only a beginning, not an ending. The campaign would continue, perhaps for years. More battles, more deaths, more choices too complicated for easy answers. But he had learned something today, or perhaps simply accepted what Aristotle had tried to teach him long ago in the grove at Mieza, that life was not about reaching destinations, but about the journey itself, about how you traveled rather than where you arrived. He had led with courage, had shown mercy when he might have been cruel, had tried to honor the principles he believed in even in the chaos of war, and that, he decided, would have to be enough. Victory was fleeting, glory ephemeral as morning dew, but virtue endured, and so he would continue, would face whatever came, not because he sought glory or feared death, but simply because this was his path, these were his people, this was his purpose, and in accepting that, in saying yes to his fate one more time, Alexander found peace, not the peace of endings, but the peace of continuing, not the peace of success, but the peace of effort. And outside his tent, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, indifferent to human striving, patient as they had always been, witnessing another moment in the endless story, another thread woven into the tapestry, another young man learning what it meant to live, to lead, to become. After Issus, the world changed its mind about Alexander. He was no longer Philip's presumptuous son, no longer a boy king gambling on fortune. He was a conqueror in his own right, a force that could not be ignored or dismissed. Ambassadors came from across the known world, from distant kingdoms offering alliance, from Greek cities renewing their pledges, even from Darius himself offering terms. The great king proposed to cede all lands west of the Euphrates, to pay enormous tribute, to give his daughter in marriage. In exchange, Alexander would halt his advance, would leave the heart of Persia untouched. Alexander's generals urged him to accept. The offer was beyond generous. They had achieved more than they ever dreamed possible. Why risk it all by pushing deeper into the unknown? But Alexander declined, not out of greed, but because he had seen something at Issus, had seen the Persian army break, had seen that the empire's power was illusion, magnificent illusion, but illusion nonetheless. And he believed, truly believed, that he could create something better, a world where Greek and Persian lived as equals, where philosophy and learning flowed freely, where war might give way to peace under enlightened rule. Was this hubris or vision? He no longer knew. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps every great enterprise required a measure of madness, of believing the impossible might be achieved when wiser men saw only folly. He wrote to Darius, refusing his terms, and the message was courteous but firm. There was no room for two suns in the sky. One must set so the other might rise. The campaign would continue, and so Alexander turned south toward Egypt, the ancient land of pyramids and mysteries. The journey took months, through lands that had known conquest before his grandfather was born, places where gods still walked in men's dreams, where the desert met the sea, where time itself seemed to move differently. The vastness of it humbled him. These lands did not care who ruled them. They had watched pharaohs and Persian kings come and go like seasons, had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. What was one Macedonian youth against such immensity? And yet, he persisted, not because he thought himself important, but because something in him could not do otherwise. It was as if he were being pulled forward, drawn like iron to a lodestone, towards some destiny he could not name but could not refuse. At night, under stars that seemed larger and closer here than in Macedonia, Alexander would think about purpose, about whether we choose our paths or they choose us, about whether free will was real or simply the name we gave to dancing with fate. And he found, strangely, that it didn't matter whether he was author of his story or merely actor in someone else's drama. The task was the same: to act with virtue, to lead with wisdom, to embrace both the joy and sorrow of being alive. The desert taught him silence, taught him that sometimes the loudest truths were spoken without words. And in that silence, in the vast patient presence of sand and stone and sky, Alexander learned a new kind of peace, the peace of being very small in a very large world, the peace of accepting that he would never understand everything, never control everything, never be more than one brief candle in an eternal night. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Egypt welcomed Alexander not as conqueror, but as liberator. The Persians had ruled harshly, disrespecting ancient customs, offending gods whose worship was older than memory. Alexander was different. He honored the temples, made offerings to Egyptian deities, showed reverence for traditions he barely understood but deeply respected. The priests proclaimed him Pharaoh, son of Amun-Ra, and while his Greek companions smiled at such bombast, Alexander took it seriously, not because he believed himself literally divine, but because he understood that leadership was partly theater, partly living up to what others needed you to be. He journeyed to the oracle at Siwa, deep in the desert, a place so remote that reaching it required crossing trackless wastes under pitiless sun. The journey itself was ordeal and meditation, days of riding with sun, like hammer on anvil, nights under stars so numerous they seemed a second sand. When they finally arrived, the temple rose from the oasis like a vision, palm trees swaying, water sparkling, priests in white robes moving with timeless grace. Alexander went alone into the inner sanctuary. What passed there between young king and ancient oracle? No one knows. He never spoke of it, never revealed what questions he asked or what answers he received. But when he emerged, something in his eyes had changed. He seemed more settled somehow, more at peace with who he was and what he was doing, as if uncertainty had been acknowledged and then set down like a burden no longer needed. Perhaps the oracle told him he was divine. Perhaps it told him he was mortal. Perhaps it spoke in riddles that could mean everything. and nothing but whatever transpired in that dim chamber, fragrant with incense, heavy with centuries of seeking. Alexander came out ready to embrace his fate fully, to accept that he might indeed touch the divine, not through literal godhood, but through excellence, through using his gifts completely, through becoming everything he had potential to become. And in this acceptance, this willingness to believe in his own possibilities, there was tremendous power. He could no longer doubt, could no longer hold back, had to give himself entirely to the path before him. On the journey back from Siva, as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert breathed its ancient patience, Alexander thought about all that had changed since he left Macedonia. The boy who crossed the Hellespont was gone, transformed by victories and responsibilities into someone new. Yet the essence remained, the love of learning, the loyalty to friends, the desire to build something beautiful and lasting. These had not changed. These would never change. And he realized that transformation was not abandonment of self, but refinement, like ore becoming bronze through fire, like diamond emerging from coal through pressure. All the contradictions he carried, the philosopher and the warrior, the merciful and the ruthless, the human and the divine, these were not conflicts to be resolved, but polarities to be held. Wisdom lay not in choosing one over the other, but in knowing when each was needed, and strange as it seemed, in accepting these paradoxes rather than trying to eliminate them, he found new depth of peace, the peace of complexity rather than simplicity, the peace of embracing mystery rather than demanding certainty. Under the Egyptian stars, older than any human civilization, Alexander smiled. For the first time in months, he felt truly at rest. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded a city, naming it after himself as he had done before, and would do many times more. But this Alexandria was different, special in ways he could feel, but not articulate. He chose the site carefully, where the Nile met the sea, where trade routes from Africa and Asia and Europe might converge. He walked the perimeter himself, marking where walls would rise, where harbors would be dug, imagining streets and markets and libraries yet unbuilt. The architects followed his vision, sketching plans that would outlast empires, and Alexander saw in his mind's eye what this place might become: a jewel of learning, a meeting place of cultures, where Greek philosophy might dance with Egyptian wisdom, where merchants speaking a dozen tongues would exchange not just goods, but ideas. This was the true conquest, not taking land, but building something new upon it, not destroying what had been, but creating what might be. In quiet moments, he would stand at the site and dream, seeing beyond the empty sand to the city that would stand here for millennia. And in these visions, he found purpose deeper than military glory. If he could create such places, could foster such exchange, could build bridges between cultures rather than walls, then perhaps all the violence and death might be justified. Perhaps the cost might be worth the creation. But even as he thought this, doubt whispered. Was he not simply rationalizing, quoting ambition in philosophy's garb, claiming noble purpose for what was ultimately about power? He did not know, could not know, could only try his best and hope the universe would forgive his mistakes. The night before leaving Egypt, he climbed to a high place overlooking the site of his new Alexandria. The Mediterranean stretched before him, dark and vast, meeting the sky in a line that could be either separation or unity, depending on how you looked at it. Behind him lay Egypt, ahead lay Persia and the unknown beyond. He thought of his mother, wondered what she would think of her son now, thought of his father, wished desperately Philip could see what he had accomplished. But they were not here. He carried them in memory and heart, but the choices were his alone, as were the consequences. The stars emerged, forming constellations that sailors had followed since before writing was invented. The same patterns that had guided Odysseus home from Troy, that had witnessed Alexander's hero Achilles win his eternal fame. And Alexander understood that he was part of a story much older than himself, that heroes had always struggled with the same questions, always wrestled with purpose and mortality, always wondered if their striving mattered in the vast indifference of eternity. And the answer, he decided, was both yes and no. In cosmic terms, nothing they did mattered. All would be dust eventually. The stars would die. The universe would end. But in human terms, everything mattered. Every kindness shown, every beauty created, every moment of courage or compassion or connection. These were ends in themselves, needed no greater justification, were valuable precisely because they were temporary, precious because they were brief, and so he would continue, not because his actions were cosmically significant, but because they were humanly meaningful, because his friends deserved his best effort, because the people he governed deserved wise leadership, because the life he had been given demanded to be lived fully, not perfectly, but fully, with all mistakes and doubts and failures accepted as part of the journey. And in this acceptance, this saying yes to life in all its complexity and contradiction, Alexander found the deepest peace he had ever known. Not the peace of having arrived, but the peace of traveling well. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of commitment. And as dawn broke over Egypt, painting the desert gold, illuminating the empty sand where a great city would one day stand, Alexander rose, ready to face whatever came next, ready to continue becoming, ready to write the next chapter of a story that would echo through all the ages yet to come. And so the journey continued, north and east, back toward the heart of Persia, where Darius was gathering his forces, preparing for one final confrontation that would decide the fate of empires. But that is a story for another night, another telling. For now, in this moment of pause before the next great test, let us stop and simply breathe. Let us remember not the battles and the victories, but the quiet moments between them. Alexander sitting with Hephaestion watching the stars, or walking through a foreign marketplace, marveling at goods he had never seen, or reading a letter from Aristotle by lamplight, finding comfort in words that connected him to home and to wisdom. Let us remember the boy in the grove at Miesa, eyes wide with wonder as he learned that everything was connected, that the same force that moved the stars moved within his own heart. And let us remember that this boy, now a man, now a king, now a legend in the making, was still at his core that same curious soul, still asking the same questions about meaning and purpose and how to live well. Some things do not change, no matter how far we travel or how much we achieve. The questions persist, the mysteries remain, and that is as it should be. Life is not meant to be solved, but to be lived, not to be conquered, but to be experienced, not to be understood, but to be felt in all its depth and texture. Alexander understood this, or was beginning to. He had lived more in his 23 years than many do in long lifetimes, had experienced extremes of joy and sorrow, victory and loss, love and grief, and through it all, he had somehow remained himself, bruised perhaps, changed certainly, but essentially the same. That boy who tamed Bucephalus by understanding rather than force, who made peace between farmers by showing them wisdom over conflict, who honored his teachers and loved his friends and tried, always tried, to act with virtue, even when it was hard. This was Alexander's true glory, not what he conquered, but who he remained, not what he achieved, but how he carried himself through achievement and failure alike. And as we leave him here, on the eve of new challenges, with Persia still unconquered and destiny still unfolding, let us take with us the lessons he learned, that courage is not absence of fear but action despite, that wisdom is knowing we don't know and seeking anyway, that strength is holding contradictions without breaking, that peace is not destination but practice, and that we are all, every one of us, on our own journeys, facing our own tests, writing our own stories, and like Alexander, we can choose to meet each moment with awareness and intention, to lead our lives rather than merely living them, to remain curious and humble, even as we grow confident, to honor the connections that sustain us, and to remember when the weight feels too heavy and the path unclear, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that our struggles echo struggles that have always been, that we are not alone in our questions or our questing. The stars that shone on Alexander shine on us. The same voice that spoke to him in the oracle speaks in our hearts. The same choice that faced him faces us to be fully alive, fully present, fully committed to becoming. And in this choice, repeated moment by moment, day by day, life by life, we find not escape from difficulty, but meaning within it, not certainty, but purpose, not perfection, but peace. And so, let the story rest for now. Let Alexander sleep beneath foreign stars. Let the army camp in temporary quiet. Let the future wait, as it always waits, patient and inevitable. And let us find our own rest, our own peace, carrying forward into dreams these truths that transcend time, these patterns that repeat eternally, this peace that passes understanding. Breathe in, breathe out, the same breath Alexander drew, the same breath that connects all living things. And in this breath, this moment, this eternal now, all is well, all is exactly as it needs to be. Rest now, rest.